So Ibn Khaldūn was no name. So was he? Ibn Khaldūn lived in the 14th century, and he was, according to Arnold Toynbee, I quote, the most illuminating interpreter of the morphology of history that has appeared so far. Ibn Khaldūn can be defined as a philosopher of the state, in fact. So what is a state? That is a problem. It can be reduced to a single word, a state: taxation. Taxation. The fiscal income is concentrated in the capital, and it is spent lavishly by the master of the state to provide pleasures and comforts and to satisfy their artistic taste or intellectual curiosities, for example. And this demand stimulates economic activity, the diversification of crafts, and the development of new technologies and skills. In other words, what we would say today, gains of productivity. The only possible gains in an otherwise stagnant agrarian society. This progress, then, is based on an initial inequality, which is indeed a form of violence, and that violence is taxation, precisely. Consequently, the existence of the state implies the subjugation of people. The state is a process of disarmament and accumulation of wealth through taxation, of course, and it civilizes in the full meaning of the term. That is, it creates a civil society, a peaceful society, an unarmed society, and a defenseless society. It draws a clear line between that society living under its protection and subjugation and the Bedouin tribal society beyond its borders, over which it has no control. Yet, it needs both words. It uses the violence of the tribal Bedouin society to impose peace and subservience and disarmament over the sedentary and productive peoples. The state establishes a new kind of society by turning violence and human solidarities into prosperity. This unarmed, individualistic, productive, and tax-paying population is called, by Ibn Khaldūn, sedentary people. That is, sedentary people. If we bring back the terms sedentary and Bedouin to their true meaning, for Ibn Khaldūn, I mean, that is, under the state control for sedentary and outside the state control for Bedouin, this theory relevance can be extended well beyond the context of Islam or medieval period, as soon as the basic organization of a state is founded on the complete segregation of the subservient, productive, individualistic majority on one side and the strong, violent, and cohesive minorities in charge of order and in charge of defense on the other side. Well, 2 points. The true model of the state for Ibn Khaldūn, as what he had in mind, was the empire, in fact, unchallenged in its time, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Islamic Abbasid Empire, etc. The empire's authority extends over all the productive lands at sight. All men under the sky, to put it in the terms of the first emperor of China in the 3rd century BC. It's the only neighbors of the empire are Bedouins, from whom the empire purchases or suffers violence. This latter is a crucial point. An empire is much likely to fall to barbarian invasions when the barbarians recognize that it is the center of the world and the sole true model of civilization. The prestige of sedentary life made it easier for the empire to buy barbarian violence and to suffer barbarian invasion in exchange for the acknowledgement of its superior civilization. Second point, to ensure the peaceful and efficient collection of taxes, the state must eradicate any remain of violence or solidarity, including the violence that brought the empire into existence. There is no empire, consequently, which is naturally inclined to war. No empire inclined to war. Every empire is peaceful, for Ibn Khaldūn, of course. This distinction marks the main difference between Ibn Khaldūn and the great names of European political philosophy, among them Hobbes, of course, Locke, Montesquieu, Max Weber, whatever. The Europeans were perfectly convinced of the hegemonic power of the state and its limitless capacity for violence. By contrast, Ibn Khaldūn insisted on the structural weakness of the state and its tendency to self-destruct by disarming its subjects and itself. When the state has succeeded in controlling and eradicating all violence, it is left defenseless, which means that it needs to engage violence in the form of mercenaries generally. This, in turn, means that more and more capital is spent on the military, draining public finances and ultimately destroying the civil society it was supposed to enrich. So, the end. The theory remains relevant throughout the history of empires until modern times, but something new appears on the horizon in the second half of the 18th century. That is what we call the Industrial Revolution. For the first time since the formation of empires 2 millennia earlier, taxation ceased to be the state's main, if not exclusive, source of income. Now, for the very first time, the population and the economy grew and developed due to advances in science and technology. Societies were healthier, were better fed, and equipped with new, more efficient tools, and thus were more productive than ever before. As, for example, Tocqueville, for France, rightly notes, up until the middle of the 18th century, the idea of a general decline of humanity was widespread. It is still prevalent in the works of Voltaire or Montesquieu, for example. But after 1780, however, the notion of limitless and continual progress took hold. Well, so in an ironic twist, Europe only discovered Ibn Khaldūn in the mid-19th century when he was translated for the first time into French, at the very moment when his theory became incapable of accounting for modernity. And he became so famous as a brilliant thinker of a bygone era and a distant Oriental context. He governed colonial theory and practice in French Algeria, certainly, and even in British India. But European societies and modern nations were supposed to be inherently beyond his grasp, now and forevermore. History cannot flow backward. Or can it? Maybe. We were born in a modern world that grows ever richer and more interconnected, or we live according to the idea that history moves in one direction only, that is, forward. Most of our public discourse is based on this simple and obvious truth, of course. However, it is not inconceivable that this flow could be reversed. We may well have reached an inflection point in the dazzling trajectory of modernity, which began with the Industrial Revolution in England at the end of the 18th century. The main motors of our economies are today the demographic growth, the catching up of the living standards of a rich country by the emerging powers, and the necessary, of course, productivity gains, the artificial intelligence, etc. If those main motors were to fail and the economy to stagnate, Ibn Khaldūn theory would once more be relevant. But where are the modern Bedouins, the necessary barbarians of the Ibn Khaldūn theory? For the time being, they remain in the backstage. The modern state has suppressed them for the past 2 centuries to control every inch of its territory. However, the weakened 21st century state could give them a new life, faced with a decaying economy and the rising cost of healthcare, social programs, education, and security. The state will probably act as the Roman or the Abbasid empires did in their decline, that is, cut spending and increase revenues. This will mean tightening the control over the majority of the productive and profitable citizens. They pay taxes, and they will pay even more, as they work and respect law and order, and they are easy to subdue, even with limited available means. On the other hand, the state must break ties with any minority group for whom the costs of control and assistance far outstrip the potential tax revenues they can generate, be it because they are elderly, they are violent, or they are unproductive. They simply are not worth the money or the trouble, would say Ibn Khaldūn. Well, the new state could be more tyrannical and demanding of its productive majorities, while abandoning large territories and segments of population to the authority of tribal leaders. I'm finishing, we're doomed, in a way I finish. This process is already underway in Latin America, in Africa, in the Muslim world. Thus, we may well be on the brink of a new world, just as our ancestors were at the end of the 18th century. The transition from a stagnant society to a world of continuous growth, while we will shift in the other direction, that is from growth to stagnation. If this prediction proves true, we will have few guides to show us how to navigate these uncharted waters. Most 19th and 20th century thinkers will become irrelevant because they never envision anything but growth and progress. On the contrary, in the periods of agrarian stagnation that preceded them, few philosophers attempted to grasp the movement of a static or near-static society, because for them the social order was and had always been fixed and unchanging. Machiavelli, probably, and Ibn Khaldūn, certainly, are 2 exceptions to this rule. And as our situation unfolds, we will have occasion to pay probably much greater attention to these 2 thinkers than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you tell us a little about the relationship between philosophical reflection on the one hand and empirical experience on the other in Ibn Khaldūn's writing?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. It is probably a mystery. It's a problem. He left any, I would say, political activity when he began to write. That is, to the difference of Machiavelli, for example. Machiavelli writes because he hopes to be back in power in a few years. Ibn Khaldūn has no ambition of power, and it is difficult to understand why he is so interested in a political world he has no personal interest in. It is probably philosophical and maybe an astrological and mathematical interest, in fact. An attempt to transform the world, the political world, into rationality, simply.
Okay, thank you very much.